Hello and welcome to this interview with Professor Hélène Rey, who is giving the 2022 Keynes Lecture at the University of Cambridge. The lecture will be live streamed at 5 p.m. on Tuesday, 25th of January. Hélène Rey is researching and teaching as the Lord Bagri Professor of Economics at London Business School. She is also advising policymakers in a variety of roles, including in the Advisory Council to the IMF's Managing Director and as a member of the French Macroprudential Authority. My name is Lukas Freund, and I'm a PhD candidate here at the Faculty of Economics. Professor Rey, thank you so much for joining me and taking the time to talk to me today. Now, your lecture is entitled, Is This Time Different? Financial Follies Across Centuries. That struck me as potentially being a reference to the very influential book by Reinhardt and Rogoff released in 2009, just after the global financial crisis, which underscored the regularity with which such financial crises tended to occur. Is that interpretation of the reference correct? And you will pick up on that or revisit that theme in your lecture?
This is absolutely correct. And you get absolutely the right reference here, of course. This work of Carmen Reinhardt and Ken Rogoff has been very influential. They have documented very painstakingly all the crises that have happened in emerging markets, in advanced economies for long periods of times. And they pointed out that there are indeed some empirical regularities which seem to be popping up across these crises, across these countries. Now, they are not the only one to have found some regularities in the unfolding of crises. There are some work by other contemporary historians in economics and in the literature, which point out that indeed there seems to be a few things that happen immediately before crisis and then that lead to booms and busts. And what I'm doing here in this work is to look at that quite systematically. So I'm going to use a historical database of Jorda, Schularic, and Taylor. So it's data that starts in the 19th century and goes until now, and use this data to see whether indeed the models that could predict out of sample the Great Depressions and other similar crises in not only in the US, but across the world, can also predict going forward, first of all, the relative absence of crisis, in the post-war period, and then a lot of crises happening in the 2000 and of course around 2008 and after that. So I'm going to be really systematically investigating that claim of the Reinhardt and Rogoff book, and the answer will be yes, we can do it.
Now, if that teaser isn't enough of a reason to watch the entire lecture on Tuesday, then I don't know. Picking up on that, we haven't seen a financial crisis since the pandemic, but at the same time, 2021 was the year of GameStop mania in January, of ups and downs, continued ups and downs in cryptocurrencies, of equity markets reaching new record highs. But at the same time, public debt reached a level of the share of total global debt not seen since, I think, the mid-1960s, since obviously a huge surge in debt in 2020. So looking at these different pockets, I suppose, of financial markets, which of these should we be most worried about, if any of those?
So there's one thing I want to say right away is that any methodology that is based on historical data, and that includes the methodology I'm using, this online learning technique of machine learning, will never be able to predict crises of a kind which have never been seen before. That's kind of an obvious point, but I think it's important to explain it, because one cannot ask from economic modeling and econometrics or machine learning or whatever to predict crises of a kind that are unheard of. So, for example, in our current context, a lot of people are, I think, rightly worried about cyber risk, possibly inducing a financial crisis via attack to the payment systems or other such things. I can think of various scenarios. Well, these things have never been seen before in a systemic crisis way. We never had a systemic crisis due to cyber risk. So this would be totally not predicted by my framework, and I think by any other framework used in the literature. Similarly, a crisis that would be directly linked to the pandemic would not be predicted, because we haven't seen a systemic financial crisis linked to a pandemic. However, if the pandemic-related shock were to induce certain behavior by the banking system or asset managers that would be correlated with other types of crises that we have seen, then we could potentially pick it up. So in that spirit, obviously looking forward, what has been very specific about the current period has been the extreme valuation of a lot of assets supported by central banking, and for the right reason, because we had a very massive shock linked to the pandemic. And so we have had very rightly fiscal policy and monetary policy being very supportive. But as this support is being withdrawn, we know that in terms of the impact of financial markets, if the support is withdrawn abruptly, if we have some bad shocks, bad news, this could lead to widening of spreads and changes of valuations of assets, which could then lead to more systemic effect. So this is definitely something that we have seen before, and something to watch for, and policymakers are very aware of that.
Moving a little bit to your broader research, much of that has emphasized, I suppose, the international dimension of finance. And one of the arguments that you put forth in the wake of the global financial crisis was that a global financial cycle has transformed the famous trilemma of international finance into a dilemma. Maybe in the first instance, what is that trilemma and why is it important?
Yes, I've introduced this idea of a global financial cycle in international finance. And this was because I was quite struck by the important co-movements of a number of important variables in international economics. So if you look at asset prices around emerging markets, but also advanced economies, if you look at international capital flows, whether you look at portfolio bonds and equity flows, or you look at bank flows, you see that there is quite a bit of co-movement across these variables. So when times are good, you do have very high valuations about everywhere, and you do have a lot of international financial transaction taking place about everywhere as well. So if you actually formalize that a little bit in econometrics and you extract global factors, you do see that these global factors seem to explain quite a bit of movements in the data. So that's the first step, and that's what I call the global financial cycle. And then going one step further, you could then ask yourself, well, so traditionally we have seen the international macro through the lenses of a trilemma, which tells you that you cannot have at the same time fixed exchange rate, independent monetary policy, and free capital mobility. If you have three of them, it's not possible. You have to pick two. And one important corollary of this trilemma is that if you have free capital mobility, and if you have a flexible exchange rate, but not importantly a fixed exchange rate, then you can do your own independent monetary policy. So exchange rate flexibility is key to enable you to run an independent monetary policy. Okay, so that's something that is that has been discussed and largely advocated in the past at the IMF and other international organizations. But I think what the global financial cycle tells you, that this is not quite true. True, a flexible exchange rate gives you some degrees of freedom, but it does not insulate you from the global financial cycle. You see that in the data. Even countries with flexible exchange rate are subjected to the global financial cycle. So there is a limit there's a limit to your monetary policy to be able to actually fix your independent monetary conditions in your countries. You are importing the global financial cycle, even if you have a flexible exchange rate. You are importing it for sure if you have a fixed exchange rate, but even if you have a flexible one, you are importing the global financial cycle. And so that means, you cannot have a truly independent monetary policy in terms of being able to fix your monetary and financial conditions without having additional tools. And some of these additional tools can be macroprudential policy, or it can be capital flow management. So some of my work has precisely been about showing that you need these additional tools. You cannot rely only on the interest rate, on your independent monetary policy, to escape the global financial cycle. And then another part of my work has been to show, okay, so what is driving the global financial cycle? And there I could show, in a causal way, that the US monetary policy was an important driver of the global financial cycle. So it's impossible to identify US monetary policy shocks and to show that they have a significant effect on the global financial cycle. So that has been, some of my papers. And in addition, now I'm pursuing some more work, comparing also the effect on other central banks. So some of my co-authors are working on the ECB. I've been working also on the People's Bank of China and contrasting the effect of these central banks on the global financial cycle.
Very interesting. I suppose you put forward that argument around 2012, 2013, around the global financial crisis, or after that, and the Eurozone crisis. But those arguments strike me as potentially being quite salient today. Just at the moment, particularly, we have discussions about the US Federal Reserve potentially raising rates 4 times this year, very different from other countries. So I suppose combining those two themes, on the one hand, the importance of global spillovers, and on the other hand, the idea that at the moment there seem to be quite significant policy shifts underway, meaning ways in which our economies are governed in other areas, including unprecedented fiscal stimulus, obviously the public health domain, but also that bigger picture question of a transition to a zero carbon economy. So I suppose I'm curious whether you can say a little bit more about whether you think that there's similarly significant policy shifts underway in that international policy architecture.
Well, so first of all, you are totally right that in the current environment, what my work is saying that when there is a significant tightening of the Fed, this has important spillovers for emerging markets, but also for advanced economies. And we can, expect indeed that spreads, and in particular for more risky assets, so that means more emerging markets, of course, but everywhere else as well, will tend to open up. So this is something to be prepared for, and obviously, I think the central bankers are very aware of it, and it's better to have predictable tightening and not too abrupt tightening than to have surprise tightening, which would be which would create more negative spillovers. So absolutely, this is very relevant for the current situation. Now, the global financial cycle is one of these big spillovers, if you like. We are living in a world in which global externalities and global goods are becoming more important by the day. Of course, climate change is the big one here, right? So we're in a world in which thinking about how we deal with externalities like that, and with global public goods, how we provide global public goods, how we avoid negative spillovers is becoming more and more important. So are we institutionally equipped to deal with that? So for the global financial cycle, as I said, we think about a different set of tools besides monetary policy to be able to help there. For the case of climate change, so we have some, economists have some tools to deal with it. It is extraordinarily politically, of course, and for many reasons, difficult to use those tools internationally. So if you think about, most economists advocate that at least you need, as part of a solution, a global carbon price. But having said that, how do you actually implement a global carbon price? So in Europe, we do have a very good start with a European market for emissions, which will be strengthened, which is now much more meaningful. We went from a very low level of price of carbon to now much more sensible price of carbons, which keep on rising because we are decreasing the permits to emit in a regular basis every year. So the price is going up, and that's the way it should be. But then the big question, given that Europe is roughly 8% of global emissions, the big question is how do we have an international cooperation on this? And so there are various proposals. We can put carbon adjustment mechanisms at the border. We have to negotiate those. And we also have to hope that in other regions of the world, there will be more of a take-up in terms of carbon pricing and things like that. But this is not enough, right? Carbon price is a very important element. And then we have to think about all the investment that has to go into climate mitigation of climate change, into innovating carbon capture. We have a lot of public goods that needs to be provided here. And we have to think about that in the context where fiscal accounts are pretty stretched. So we have to think about how we can invest enough and how we can help the emerging world, which did not produce in the past much carbon emissions. So we have to deal with a stock of carbon emissions that were produced by the advanced economies, right? So that means we do need to help a lot and to do a lot of technological transfer to the emerging world. How do we do that? It's not so clear that we have right now enough institutional support and enough political cooperation to do that. And yet we have no real choice, I think.
I wanted to slightly switch gears towards the end of this conversation and move from research and policy towards the state of the profession. And in particular, you are leading the Women in Economics initiative at the Center for Economic Policy Research, or CEPR. What are, in your view, the most pressing problems in the profession as regards gender representation, and how does this initiative seek to tackle them?
I think the profession has realized that it does have a problem with diversity, and it does at many levels, and it also has a problem more specifically with women, right? If you look at the numbers, they always kind of speak for themselves. As we climb up the ladder in the profession, you go from PhD students, and then assistant, and then associate, and then full, and you see it's kind of a pyramid, and the width of the pyramid is quickly decreasing. So there is an issue with why women don't make it often to the top of a profession, and when you explore a little bit the whole things that people have to do in order to make it in the profession, the tenure process, etc. I mean, you do realize all the issues that young women in particular, I mean, I'm not saying it's easy for young men, not at all, but young women do have specific barriers to make it. And so part of the CEPR initiatives is to try to at least help overcome some of these barriers. So some of the CEPR initiative has to do with presenting some role models. And so we have a very, very nice set of videos of some prominent researchers and economists who happen to be women, and we discuss their work, we discuss whatever they want to talk about. And I think these are very nice to watch and extremely informative. And so I would totally encourage anyone to watch them. So this is the idea about projection, about role model, about motivation. I think it's important. Then we also have several things. So we do series of seminars and conferences in which, in particular for the seminars, we ask young women, junior women, to present their work, with more senior women acting as hosts. And we do that in a very, I hope, a constructive, friendly environment. And we do the same with conferences. And it does make a difference in a way. Many of my colleagues have pointed out that when we're in a conference with only women, or in seminar with only women, interactions are a lot more, friendly, positive, and there's a lot more laughing, right? And it's somehow constructive. It's not about showing how incredibly smarter you are than everyone else or something like that, and I think things like that matter, and also constructing networks matter. So we are definitely trying to do all of that and all these more kind of subtle things, as well as, of course, if we can support any kind of also mentoring programs that is done by the European Economic Association, by the Royal Economic Society, by the American Economic Association as well. Sure, so these are extremely important as well, having mentoring sessions, having feedback on papers, feedback on how you do academic life and personal life together in a way that is harmonious. All that, I think, if we can help on any of this, that's great.
What that answer clearly highlighted was the close connection between, on the one hand, the diagnosis of these are the particular challenges that women in the economics profession are facing on the one hand, and then the strategies, I suppose, that the initiative is developing to tackle those. So I'm curious whether from the operational engineering side of things, you can say a little bit more about the steps that move from this problem diagnosis to theory of change to the actual institutionalization of the CEPR initiative.
The practical steps was that, we are not building in a vacuum. There has been now committees to help women in various professional organizations in the EEA, the European Economic Association, Royal Economic Society, the American Economic Association. There has been some research also being written on what are the impediments for women, which are specific to women in research. So we do have a body of things, and so on the importance of role models, on the publication process, how tough it is, and on sometimes the lack of recognition of women in the publication process, on the tenure process, the maternity leave structure, parity or not with men. We do have papers actually published in top journals about all those issues. And so to some extent, of course, we learn from all this body of research and from practical experience. And then we just try to do as much as we can, given the experience of all these other mentoring programs, etc., which have been put in place already. And we try to build on that and to do as well as we can, especially the seminar program I was talking about for the junior women was put in place also during the pandemic time, where people were more isolated, right? So it was felt, I think, very strongly that if you are starting as a junior, and as a junior woman maybe even more, and without much of a network, and it is very hard to connect, to give talks, to go to conferences, then it's even harder than usual to actually get feedback on your work, to get a bit of visibility, to get invitations to go to conferences in the future, etc. And so partly this was this Zoom seminar, for example, was constructed to really try to build, to fill that problem, to solve that problem. Same thing for specific conferences being organized, really kind of building up a network in a time where a lot of people are isolated, especially young women. That was kind of a practical inspiration for that. And the role model, I think we have pretty good evidence that it's important.
Closing on a last question that really directly picks up on that notion of role model and inspiration. One thought behind having these invited lectures at the faculty is to motivate and inspire the economics students at the University of Cambridge. Do you perhaps have any word of advice to share, be that a research question that you deem particularly pressing, relating maybe to the first half of the interview, or a principle that you found to be particularly valuable in your own career and that you think is worth passing on?
So that research is great. That's I think I always feel extremely privileged to be able to do research. You can pick the topics that really make you passionate about. And so in my case, it turned out to be, as you see, in international finance, and now I'm more and more so interested in, of course, other types of spillovers and climate change, etc. But being extremely, I think, curious and hardworking is an important thing to try to keep up as a research career, and also not being discouraged and just persevere. And you know, if one is super passionate and you know, gets also a lot of feedback from others, being very open, etc., not take things personally when it doesn't go well, it's sometimes quite hard, right? But we have to keep going somehow. And very, you know, there are so many super important topics for society. I think a lot of young people relate very much to trying to make the world a better place. Now we really need that, given all these externalities we have been discussing. It's a super good time to dive into research, to be passionate about it, and then to have some influence.
Wonderful. I think that's a perfect way to end the interview. Thank you so much for sharing all these insights and inspirations, and very much looking forward to your lecture next Tuesday.
Thank you very much, Lukas. Looking forward to seeing you there.